Oh, we're live on Facebook.
There it is. Give that a little clickaroo.
Oh, yeah.
There we go. YouTube should be up. Just double checking and making sure.
Right on.
Would that show up on our main page? It should show up on our main page, right?
On the main YouTube page?
Yeah. Oh, there it is. There it is. There it is. All right, we are live, everybody. And I am sick, so apologies in advance if I sound horrible during this live stream. But welcome, everybody, to the Gunner Technology Livestream, a weekly 10-minute tech talk for non-techies and techies alike. With me, again, CEO of Gunner Technology, Cody Swan. How you doing, Cody?
I'm good. So you're sick, and I'm fighting some strange bug
some
bite
alien
or
bug
something.
bite that you just caught.
So yeah. We're in good shape today. I mean, we are playing injured.
We're rolling into the holiday, like aching for a holiday right now. So so last week we talked about two things. We talked about frameworks and AJAX, and actually we only briefly touched on AJAX. So do you want to give a quick recap of what AJAX is and how AJAX is used?
Sure. Actually, on the sister blog post that I did based on last week's episode, I touch on AJAX a lot more to give it more of a non-techie description. So definitely check out our blog. But to kind of get into what AJAX is, when you go to a web page, you're basically going to a URL, whether you type it into your address bar directly or you click a link. You are what we call loading a URL. And your browser loads the URL and it gets back structured data, structured visual data. This kind of data includes style sheets, HTML, images, and things like that. Your browser assembles it in a way that you can understand. We call that human readable. It's in a human readable format. AJAX is the same sort of thing, except for you don't actually initiate any process. So for example, if you type in finance.yahoo.com in your web browser, you are loading that URL. That finance.yahoo.com is a URL. You're loading that URL. Your browser will then render it. And you'll see a bunch of human readable information like stock information, stock tickers, and things like that. What's happening in the background, the script that is powering finance.yahoo.com is making AJAX calls. And it's the exact same thing as if you were to type in a URL into your browser, except for the script is loading the URL. And instead of the data being sent back being human readable format, it's in machine readable format. It's what we call a data feed. And so the script then parses that data feed and then, for example, updates the stock price for Fox on the page. You didn't do anything to make it happen. It just happened. Another example is kind of with a form. When you fill out a form and hit submit, a lot of sites now will just automatically, there'll be no visual changes. The page won't reload. You'll just see a thank you message or an error message. That's AJAX. Behind the scenes, without you seeing anything, the script is sending data to a URL to basically submit your form, whether it's a contact form or a sign-in form or whatever. So that's kind of AJAX in a very high-level nutshell.
And I think back in the day, too, it was probably more relevant as far as stuff like bandwidth, and the cost of sending a bunch of data over the web was concerned, which has sort of been mitigated at this point, right?
In one way, it has been. There used to be a golden rule that a web page shouldn't be bigger than 50K, just not including the images, but 50K. Now, if you go to web pages, there's so much script to load that you're pushing almost 1 megabyte on some websites and more on a lot of their websites. It's kind of ridiculous. So in some sense, connection speeds have gotten so much better that we can load more data on that first URL that you type into your browser. However, the big push toward mobile and globalization has brought that back into the forefront because we're a little bit spoiled in so much that we're kind of accustomed to fast mobile speeds, unlimited bandwidth, and things like that. The rest of the world, or at least the developing world, I kind of laugh because we're actually laggards in the United States behind some mobile speeds in other countries. But in the developing world, bandwidth is still a premium. Mobile connections are still very spotty at best. So as sites become more and more global, that push to get the initial data load is coming back into focus.
Okay, so I guess with frameworks and AJAX, we sort of covered the hot newness that was around in the early 2000s on the client side of the browser. So now let's jump to the other side, and I guess the question of the day would be how did JavaScript start getting used on the server side, and how does Node come into play with that?
So it was actually interesting because to go back to frameworks, and I'm going off of memory because there was a big race to get JavaScript to the server, and I'll kind of go back and say what that means. But it was interesting because in my personal experience, the same people who were responsible for the Dojo client-side network were the ones making a big push to have JavaScript available on the server. So that was my first experience with it, and it was something called the Rhino JavaScript engine at the time.
Yep. And so where did it go from Rhino? And I mean, I guess Dojo kind of got superseded on the client side, but where did it go from there?
Yeah, so let me take a little step back and explain kind of the engine because that will tie in here. As we talked about last week, Dojo was one of those frameworks that when I was evaluating frameworks way back when in 2004, 2005, I really liked Dojo, except for it was very complicated and it was tough for new developers to understand it. But they made a lot of advances in JavaScript, and one of them was pushing this Rhino engine, which was capable of delivering JavaScript on the server. And basically, what we mean by that is, I know it doesn't sound at all interesting, but until this point, all the engines for JavaScript were kind of tied, were tied to the browser. So if you used Safari, you were using the WebKit engine. If you were using Internet Explorer, you were using the Trident engine. And the engine is basically an engine, and the JavaScript itself is instructions that you feed into it. To kind of give you an example of the difference between a client and a server engine, imagine that you have directions. Your directions are kind of written to put in an engine, but that engine is a microwave. The microwave is used to cook food. Your instructions work just great, but then you try and stick those same instructions in an oven. Well, a lot of the same things, a lot of the very functional parts of a microwave aren't part of an oven. So it just doesn't work. So in terms of technology, in terms of JavaScript, the language was so tied to the browser. And what I mean by that specifically was tied to the DOM, the DOM, and it stands for dot.
Yeah, touch on that real quick. What's the DOM?
That's the document object model. And basically, as we talked about in, I think, the first episode, that's basically the HTML and CSS. To go back to our house analogy, that's the door and the color of the door. So, and like we said, if you wanted to open the door or change the color of the door, you use JavaScript to do that. JavaScripts were instructions on opening the door or repainting the door or whatever.
And so insofar as Rhino is a server-side engine, it basically has no need for that level of awareness, right?
Right. So there is no such concept as the DOM on the server. That is exclusive to the client. That's exclusive to the browser. So what a big part of JavaScript originally started out as was completely gone. There was no DOM on the server, so they had to figure that out. At the same time, because it was originally intended to be a browser-only language, some key features were missing from the language, such as how to connect to a database, how to write to a file. All those functions in the JavaScript language weren't there because the engine was never envisioned as being running on the server.
And as opposed to languages like Java, for example, that were basically made to run on the server side. That's all baked in, but it didn't really exist with JavaScript until they started building out this engine. And so I guess what is the benefit of being able to use JavaScript on the server side? Why do they even go this route?
Right. So there's a lot of benefits to having, and I don't remember the term for it, but having basically one language. The main reason that we're looking at is consolidation of resources. When you're talking about hiring a web developer, and later we can get into mobile developers, but a web developer, you have to either hire someone who knows HTML, who knows CSS, who knows JavaScript, who knows SQL, who knows a server language, like you said, Java or PHP or Ruby. So you have to have hire this guy who's a jack of all trades, who knows a lot of stuff. Or you can hire 2 people or 3 people to fill that incomplete stack. But the point is, there was a stack, and it was hard to have all that knowledge in one person, and very expensive to fill that stack knowledge among 3 or 4 people. So the advantage is, if you're pretty much soup to nuts writing the same language for the server, basically getting data out of a database, doing extreme calculations, and then also rendering that data on the client, all using JavaScript, you have a consolidation of knowledge. And not only is it more affordable to hire someone, but it's also quicker to become an expert in the global field of web development, because you only have to focus on one technology. That's the biggest benefit from our standpoint. The other benefits are pretty much, again, you have data portability. And so when you are sending data, say from Java to JavaScript, you have to put it in a format that both can understand. Well, if you're simply writing JavaScript on the server and JavaScript on the client, you can pass it back and forth with no kind of data transformation. And then also a big part of it is library consolidation. When you're using a different server language, you have a library to do this, you have a library to do that. And when I mean a library, like you'll have this is a contrived example, but a library to generate a random number. And then, so on the server, sometimes you'll generate a random number, and sometimes on the client, you'll have to generate a random number. And you're using 2 separate libraries to do that. When you have JavaScript at the back and the front, you use the same library to generate a random number.
So I guess we've run a little bit over, but that basically covers the basics of Node. And keep an eye out for our blog post. It'll probably go more in depth on a lot of those topics. Check that out at gunnertech.com. Next week, we're going to be talking about this will be the last of the 4-part series, but we'll be talking about some more fantastic newness, talking about React, and we'll probably touch on Angular a little bit too. So keep an eye out for that next Thursday, 1 p.m. I think it's a couple days after Christmas. I was going to say it's a day after, but my dates are all mixed up. Keep an eye out for the podcast coming up on iTunes. Eventually, the ebook for our JavaScript series will be up probably early next year on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, basically everywhere ebooks are sold. And I think that about wraps it up for this episode. Thanks a lot, Cody.
Yeah, man. See you next week.
All right. We'll catch you guys later. Take care.